Hello. Hello, everybody. So nice to see all those faces looking up at me. Because there will be a lot of words, I figured we'd take a moment without words, where I'll just serenade you and you can transport yourself sonically to another place. This is a sound collage I made of the jungle where I lived for the last almost 2 years. And I will share some stories with you momentarily about that time. And just so that nobody gets distracted in your mind by the various protrusions and indentations on my visage, beveled and embossed on my visage. This one is a mole, El Topo. I've had it since birth. It's a birthmark, or in Dutch, moedervlek, which means mother's stain. I haven't seen my mother in person in 8 years, and I'm about to go visit her next month, so that's nice. And then this one, as well as this one right here, is the vestiges of a flesh-eating parasite called leishmania, which sounds like leather daddy territory. Leishmania, only at House of Yes. That's a shout out to some of the folks here. I recently visited my father in Florida. He has Alzheimer's. And I was playing this soundtrack and he said, "I find these lyrics very peculiar. Do you understand what he's saying?" These are frogs after the rain, Dad. Anyway, I'm gonna leave you for the...
Just want to joke one more time.
You want me to repeat it? For the people in the back. My father has Alzheimer's. Forget about it. And I put on this soundtrack. That's a very important sound. The lizard laugh track cascading from every corner in the room, punctuating moments perfectly. So hopefully it'll come back right after this joke is repeated. My father has Alzheimer's, and I played this jungle soundtrack for him, and he said, "I find these lyrics peculiar. Do you understand what he's saying?" Dad, these are frogs after a heavy rainfall. So now, take a moment, find yourself here through the looking glass of the Athenaeum, out of the city, into the jungle, because as humans we're so permeable and malleable that we can become what we behold. So with eyes closed and sound shaping you, let us transport ourselves to some other place. And then I'll be back with more words, words, words. Ladies, gentlemen, and those who bridge the binary, we have gathered here today in observance of something vague. We're not entirely sure why we are here today, but perhaps since we are here, we can make the most of it. Perhaps we can all get along and figure out why we are here. Perhaps you are here because you thought something interesting was going to come out of my mouth. It could happen. The night is young. Perhaps we will even forge a form for ourselves so that we may compete with the emptiness to which we are heir. One night there was a sound coming from deep inside the jungle. You could rave to its rhythms for days. Sometimes it sounded like it was coming from really far away, and other times it sounded like it was chirping right in my earballs. At times I thought it was a theurgic orgy of fucking monkeys. Other times I thought it was a snake swallowing a frog. Birds, perhaps? An ancient witchcraft lurking deep inside this jungle. And you know, in those moments when you don't know what it is you're listening to, anything is possible. And that is a potent liminal state to find yourself in. I wanted to start a religion based on this sound. We'd build a fortress around it, a sanctuary. We'd gather people. We'd find different dances to appease the sound. Musicians would tune into it and they'd mine melodies from it. At times you could hear voices within the white noise of the sound. At times visions would bloom in your mind's eye listening to the sound. And that's kind of the nature of culture, isn't it? We gather around this vortex of a mystery as though it were a campfire, and we share stories around it, because a vortex of mystery attracts name games to its center. And not just names, but all kinds of attitudinal expressions in the face of the mystery. And that gets shelved in culture, and sometimes that becomes a congealed scab on the bleeding mystery. And sometimes we want to pick that scab and let it bleed, so that we can return to the origins where all this cultural database came from. Return to the origins, the original thought. A few days later, we were put out of our mystery. It was the toucans of the Yucatan visiting us in the daytime. Folks, I haven't been to New York City in a long time. I used to spend a lot of time here back in 2001. I was gonna move here. I used to come here because a friend of mine, he'd let me house sit when his parents would go back to Europe, and I would help him as he was producing films when he went to the new school. And one day I was location scouting, and I was on the lookout for a place to watch the sun rise over the East River. And a man came jogging up to the traffic light, and I said, "Excuse me, sir, do you know any place where I can watch the sun rise over the East River?" He says, "Well, I'm blind, but I know the place well, so I'll show you around." So I got a sightseeing tour from a blind man. And he told me, after I told him I was from the Netherlands, and of course New York used to be New Amsterdam, Haarlem, Brooklyn, Breukelen. He told me, and I never fact-checked this, and I never will, you know why they call it the Bronx? Because it used to be a Dutch family, the Bronk family, and they'd say, "We're going over to the Bronx." I will never fact-check that, I love it too much. So, yeah, then that thing happened, you know, some planes flew into a building, and then I didn't want to move here anymore because the landscape kind of changed. My whole life kind of changed that way. And you know what, you've probably noticed I kind of slip in and out of these different personae. You might be wondering, like, who is this guy? Who does he think he is? Well, they always teach us, you know, to be yourself. Be yourself, they say. Well, you first got to know who that is then, isn't it? So, I always say, don't be yourself. Be someone else. Because it's not until you take leave of the limitations of who you believe yourself to be that you can become who you truly are, beyond your self-imitating limitations, and become full expression. And that's kind of what I am exploring through this night of storytelling and through the journey of this artwork. We are almost wholesome on our way towards embracing the various repressed, suppressed, disowned, and estranged parts of ourselves back into totality. Now, where does that leave us? Mimicry. I'm here actually because, well, first of all, let's talk about ungoogleability for a moment. Like, what makes something ungoogleable? Like, literally, you know? Or you can't Google him. You put my name into a search engine, what do you get? Ninja Turtles and Renaissance painters all the way down. But the paradox of ungoogleability is that the ungoogleable Michelangelo is Googleable. Ungoogleable. But ungoogleability also is unquantifiability, unmappability. It's hard to contain this genie in a bottle, or this entheogen, as I like to think of it. So that's me shrugging off the various forms. But now, if you're someone as strange as and uncontainable as myself, how do you brand that? You have this anti-branding campaign, you know? So I found one way that people are interested is if, for instance, you take the shape of someone they know well, someone they're very familiar with, such as Terence Mckenna, a long-beloved psychonaut, and psychedelic bard, philosopher, author, and storyteller. Someone who is greatly missed in the community, just for the entrainment of his tone, his timbre. You never know what he's going to say next, and it doesn't even really matter. You can hang on to his every word, and that's the meaning of a spell-binding orator. And so comedian Shane Moss had approached me to create an introduction to his new show, A Better Trip, as Terence Mckenna. And Shane Moss performed here at the Athenaeum, the world's first psychedelic library, social club, and event space in the heart of Midtown Manhattan. I've got the spiel down. And Kat and Susie, who are the founders of this wonderful space, heard this voice and reached out to me to write and narrate the promo for their video that would tell the story of their origins and their mission statement. And so that's kind of, you know, this pretending to be someone else, or raising the dead for a living, as I like to think of it. It's kind of trickster territory. And that's where I want to take you tonight. Because it's very similar to the way that a psychedelic experience will communicate with you, you know. I think of it slightly differently than the narratives that have been cemented or fortified. I like to think of a psychedelic experience, you know, the intelligence at play in there. I'm not sure if there's a spirit to ayahuasca or a spirit to the mushroom, or that it's something other, that's truly other, rather than the otherly dimensions of the self that are brought to the forefront. So I like to think of it as this sort of well, that's the imitation mimicry. We'll get back to that. A kind of VR, you know, vegetal reality. An interface between your biology and your psychology. Somewhere on the border of the virtual and the spiritual, so to speak. And it will communicate with you in the same way that I might, in a kind of shape-shifting manner, where it will clothe itself, the otherly part of yourself, in familiar forms, so as to be able to convey custom messages from your biology to your psychology. And so it's part of my psychedelic maturation journey has been very much, I used to look for the entities with my head up in space, and then later I found them in the body, and then I started finding them in the garden around me, and before you knew it, boundary dissolution was something very real, as you can see by the ways that it has penetrated my defenses and became a part of me. And that's also part of being a bardo bard, a storyteller of liminal spaces, is that there are different non-human things that want their stories told. So I think of myself as a folklorax, one who speaks for the folklore. And so here we have some older paintings of mine under the banner of VR vegetal reality, where, for instance, the leaves of the chacaruna plant, which is the DMT-containing plant used in ayahuasca, are called hojas de chacaruna, hojas, ojos, eyes, leaves. So these little leaf-shaped lenses, I consider them introspectacles. And by lending you their vision, you gain access into this vegetal realm and into deeper parts of your own self, because I think we're animal bodies with vegetal minds. Because the mind, or the brain, opens itself to the light the same way that plants would open themselves to the light, and over time we learn to hold light, and we learn to nurture and water ourselves with awareness. So back to the mimicry and imitation thing for a second. Philip K. Dick, is anybody here a fan of Philip K. Dick's writings? Not a lot of not a lot of dickheads here, huh? Some, okay. So he wrote a book called Valis, which is a real mind bender. It's somewhat autobiographical. It takes elements of his own psychotic break, where he kind of teeters the line between psychosis and religious revelation. And he established contact with a thing he called Valis, the vast, active, living intelligence system, through a pink beam that shot open his third eye. And he claimed that Valis, he also called it zebra, because it camouflaged itself. This vast, active, living intelligence system would camouflage itself, not in the sense that this little mantis camouflages itself with this tree. It would camouflage itself as our world. A very Gnostic notion. And similarly, if you find yourself in private, the mind surrounds you. And when you find yourself in public, the mind becomes a private matter that you share through body language, small mouth noises, and yes, thank you for the small mouth noises. Give it up for the non-human delegation in the room. And I, similarly, when I first started working with ayahuasca in 2003, I had some experiences where, actually during my second experience, this is another impression of it, this giant bulbous saucer flew over me, and with this kind of multidimensional telepathy of colored burning coals burning onto my mind's eye's retina, would convey these very complex messages. And one of the first ones, and this doesn't sound very complex, but it sounds like a platitude, as many of the things we'll mine from these deep spaces will come back and we'll be like, wow, love is the answer. After this incredibly deep experience, I'm going to have a bite at Cafe Platitude. It said, this is the light. This is what people talk about when they say they have seen the light. And later I came to refer to this as a saucer mind, and very much like Philip K. Dick's idea of zebra, it was something that borrows our thought patterns and our behavioral patterns so as to disguise itself as you. And this is what you find in moments of, for instance, addictive behavior or compulsive behavior. It's your own voice telling you things. But what I then learned is that if there's, for instance, negative self-talk, a little voice that says, "You're no good, you suck," it's talking about itself. And when you turn the mirror on it, it will basically hate itself into non-existence. So that's the saucer mind, right there. So, art as strange, forbidden fruit. Yes?
I don't think that you mentioned that most of the art that you're showing pictures of is your original art that you made.
Oh, yes, good point.
And then
It's all me, folks.
And it's for sale.
Well, the stuff on the wall is for sale, yeah. It is all my art unless otherwise stated, and the stuff on the wall, which I'll get into more, was all stuff I created during my time in the jungle. In the jungle.
It's good to know that it's your art.
Yeah, it is good to know. It's good to know for me too, I forget, you know. Art as strange forbidden fruit is this idea that when you look at the artwork, it's just some strange, otherly, maybe somewhat exotic, maybe tasty for hungry eyes. But that's not enough, because you'd learn a lot more if you find out about the tree that the strange fruit grew on, and the orchard in which that tree grew, and the shadows which it had to evade in order to grow towards the light. And so I want to take you on a journey through my own oracular orchard where this strange fruit originated from, and a little bit about my journey as an artist and the ways that psychedelics have influenced me on that journey. Are you here for it?
Yes.
Yes.
Full consent.
So, what have we here? These are two properties in the Mexican jungle. In the jungle. Do we have Werner Herzog fans in the house? 1, 2, 3. We got a few. So, Herzog, I love him. I love doing my Herzog impression, and it's gained new meaning in the light of flesh-eating parasites. His whole spiel about the jungle goes something like, this is an unfinished country. This land, God, if he exists, has created in anger. It's yet an unfinished country. And so there is a sort of a curse, and anybody who goes deep into that territory will be given some of that curse. So in a sense, we are cursed with what we are doing here. And Kinski thinks that there is something erotical about the jungle, but I don't think it is erotical at all. All I see is asphyxiation and murder and fornication, overwhelming fornication. Even the stars here in the sky are a mess. And we, as we enter into this vast articulation, we are like poorly written sentences in some poorly written novel, some stupid suburban novel. And you must understand, I don't hate the jungle. I say all this with the greatest admiration for the jungle. I love it. I love it very much. But I love it against my better judgment. So I moved to the jungle a couple of years ago. And I'll get into the call and all that stuff first. But first I just want to introduce you to these two sentient buildings that are like self-portraits of their architects. This one, Casa Caracol, also known as the snail house or the shell house, was built by a wizard, or rather warlock, meaning oath breaker, because wizard still has a certain grandeur to it, but you know, there's, as the architecture itself illustrates, there are some perverted dimensions. You cannot sit on any of these toilets without somebody potentially watching you. You can sit on the top toilet and look down at somebody on the bottom toilet. And then there is Qualia, the neighboring property, which is, after this one, I said, I don't ever want to live in a place again with walls that aren't spherical, circular. And then we moved in there where there were no walls. And this is part of what is known as Caracol Labs, founded by Mr. Wesley Ahara and Alexa Castle, here in white. Which is it's been called a free-form art farm. It's been called an artist residency. There is no real, it's a malleable and informal space, but it is a residency, a residence for artists to create in. And a lot of, actually all of this art was created in there. And Caracol Labs is a portmanteau of caracol, which means snail or spiral, and labs, because it is a kind of social laboratory and library in the jungle, much like this place is. And then it's also cara and collabs, which is face and collabs, which, you know, explains my collaboration with the environment. Oh, they'll be coming. You gotta face the music, you know. So this is my main thesis tonight that I want to bring to you is, and these are big words, and I'm gonna pick them apart for you. Don't worry. I won't leave anybody scratching their head, unless lice. That count as face jokes. Pareidolia is the tendency for perception to find meaningful patterns in random stimuli. Faces in the clouds, Jesus on toast, that sort of thing. Things we're all familiar with from our days as children, just a wondrous world opening up, but as the busy give and take of modern life and adulthood casts our gazes down onto the sidewalk and onto our LCD screens and away from the miraculous elemental revelations, we forget about this. So I'm here to remind you of pareidolia. Daemonic interface. What do I mean by that? A daemon is the Greek version of what in Roman lore would be considered a genius, a kind of birth god, a part of you that's larger than you, that's with you. I think of it as an avatar or an ambassador of our unconscious, of our entelechy, another big word which just means the realized potential of who we are. Our higher self, wider self, deeper self. The part of ourselves that we're cut off from as we navigate through the maze of life. And so pareidolia for me is a daemonic interface. By looking at the clouds, for instance, the faces that prompt themselves, what are these faces? What are the faces, the characters that come through in my art when I create a random priming and they come through? I think of them oftentimes as the disowned and estranged and repressed and suppressed parts of the self. I started noticing this especially when I kind of took all my filters off and started creating and basically just opened up the borders. Anybody's welcome, acceptance for all. Everybody just wants to be seen and heard. And all the perverts and all the weirdos and all the freaks just came pouring to the forefront. And it was very liberating to acknowledge them and to realize that we're that too. You know? My mother used to make faces in my food. I made faces at my food. And so that was probably the first introduction to this idea of pareidolia in a practical manner. She wasn't aware of that, but that's her particular brand of motherly witchcraft. And now I don't eat anything without a face. More face jokes.
More face jokes.
I think that pareidolia has its roots as a vestige of evolutionary vigilance. In the grasslands or in the jungles, we kept our eyes peeled for faces of predators. But what happens when you take something like consciousness, which was originally a means to outsmart a predator or to think ahead in the future or back in time? What happens when you don't have to run from anything and you can let that fist unfold and bloom and be a thing for itself? And that's what I like to explore. And also I think that a lot of like paranormal phenomena like ghosts or entities or even conspiracies like QAnon that happened a few years ago, where random data gets flooded into the masses and they start plotting constellations within that, and then that is the truth that, you know, that's what's happening in the world. So here's a great illustration. Like, as a pareidolic person, I often wake up in this kind of liminal state between waking and dreaming, where a pile of clothes turns into a specter, or, you know, oftentimes they're also just straight up hallucinations. A lot of times it's spiders. I've had some encounters with spiders in visionary spaces where we made a trade because I had been complicit in the murder of a tarantula, which then a wallpapered tribe of tarantulas came to confront me an hour later in an ayahuasca ceremony And I tried to explain, you know, it's like, yeah, you know, we're gringos. We don't know this jungle. You know, we don't know Peru. You know, if one of us bumps into you, you know, you might kill us. And so the shaman came and he like knocked you out. And I stood by and I held the light and I'm sorry. It's like, anything I can do, like, what can I do? I can tell your story. And they liked that. So without asking for it, the spider took off its eyes. It lifted its eyes like a crown and placed it on my head like a VR goggles, and I saw the world through spider eyes and became an arachnid raconteur from there on out. So I speak still to this day. I keep my promise that I made to them. And they show up to me in liminal hallucinations. And so also in the jungle, spiders and scorpions, I would just escort them out and treat them with respect that they deserve. Unlike those mosquitoes. So our attention was seduced away from the clouds and the elemental world and facing the concrete that we trampled down. And so I, at some point, started carrying a piece of chalk with me and started stain spotting. This was right around the time that I had started a Scottish rap project, so it's like everything's got to have some kind of a Scottish twist, you know, train spotting, stain spotting, that sort of thing. But what happened was that I started seeing, you know, like I started seeing forms in filth. And I started carrying chalk with me, and usually chalk outlines mark where the dead have fallen, and in this case it marks where the imagination arose. Nowadays, you know, I do it more digitally. I think I've got dirty mind. I'm not trying to get my hands dirty too. I did these this morning. I made them for promotion for this event as well. I made this little demonic avatar say, you know, go, go, go to the event. And then I told people to listen to the little voice in their heads that tells them to go. I'm glad you all did. You're all winning. And these are the gumdrop constellations of connection that we can plot on the sidewalks. So in a sense, the idea behind this is that what we think of as an obstacle is actually an oracle. What we think of as dense matter, as an end, as finite, is actually a springboard into what I call the meta-real world. It's not the material world anymore. The material world is a psychic teleprompter through which we can prompt forms from our unconscious, and that's really where all the magic and the other worlds reside. Not to sound reductionistic in any sense, I'm not trying to like reduce it down to something. It's a big world, and the deeper you go, the bigger it gets. So that takes us to La Mancha Sagrada, the sacred stain. These are some pieces that I plotted and spotted on a wall in Xilitla, Mexico, in the rainforest where I met Amy and Monica and Marie. Anybody else I met here? Well, you guys brought me there. What?
Hell yeah, cave life.
Cave life. There's a cave, there's a rainforest, you're on a mountaintop surrounded by coral, you're under the sea, on top of the world, and there's a lady known as La Coneja, a mad little Russian rabbit ballerina lording over this space.
Yes, this is how she sounds. Yes. Nobody can paint on my walls except for you. I like what you make here. You make the manchas.
And I was like, the manchas? Mancha means stain. La Mancha Sagrada for me speaks to the primordial Rorschach. It is my belief that the world was once a pristine void, that nothing happened for anybody in particular until an accident, a stain. This is what's funny about brainwashing, you know? Brainwashing is trying to clean the stain, but we worship the stain on the brain because this is where the magic happens. This is the mind. This is the ink that the printing press gave us, the wet ink that left an impression on our minds so that now we can look at pieces of paper with little marks scribbled on them and hear a voice laboring on in severed tongues. That's a surreal thing to think about. Don't think about it too long because the thinking happens according to the primordial Rorschach. And the Rorschach, again a big word, ink blot, you know, Rorschach test. So I like to think of this all as a Rorschach worship workshop. Thank you for attending. Also, that brings to mind the man from La Mancha, Don Quixote. Don Quixote was a man. This one comes with a little rhyme. Let's see if I remember it. These floors are quite quixotic. Nightmares for days, windmills for miles, exotically neurotic. No, wait, it goes the other way around. These floors are quite quixotic. Windmills for miles, nightmares for days, exotically neurotic. It's weirding me out in wondrous ways. Don Quixote was the man who read too many romance novels and could not distinguish fantasy from reality. Mind as media. We've all been stained by media, and so we can no longer have immediate experience. Terence McKenna used to speak about the felt presence of immediate experience. That's experience where there is no medium. That's why it's felt. You feel me? So I call it quixotification, when we plot our own perceptions in the random world at large. And there's a danger in that when we don't acknowledge that our own perceptions are interwoven into the design. And we think of the divine design, the divined design. We're complicit in the crime of creation. We stole the formlessness out of the void. We populated it with our forms, our ideas, our concepts. And now, I guess we have no choice but to keep creating and keep filling it up, this endless, unfinished creation, until we reach the end and we can be void once again. Okay, we can get wordy for a second. I'm going to dive down and you can read along. Sing along if you know the words. Stop me if you heard this one. Consciousness is an interiority complex, but that interiority, in fact, surrounds us. Reality is not objective fact, but becomes by our subjectivity objectified, imbuing the senseless, tasteless, colorless world with the quaintness of qualia. At its root, pareidolia uncovers an ontologically profound truth, that the spontaneously arising faces in the clouds are not just projected onto the external world, but that the sensorial input of the outside world is processed inside us before it is projected and simultaneously perceived as external. And not just this, but it is then glazed in a veneer of assumption to keep us from questioning the uncanny nature of just how out there it truly is. And so what happens when we don't keep this in mind? Evolutionists flock towards Darwin-shaped wall stain. That's when we get to the realms from pareidolia into what I call pareidolatry. It's where you think that this is literally Jesus on toast. You're forgetting that we can always return. We can always return to la mancha sagrada, that unprimed prima materia of the mind, unshaped by our perceptions. And so this gives us a sense of flexibility, which is very useful in everyday life, I think, when you realize that reality is reified and need not be deified. I call it abyss malleability. So there's also a auditory form of pareidolia. As I was taking care of my father recently, as I mentioned, he has Alzheimer's, and sometimes he would wander at night towards the door, and I'd intercept him, and I'd say, "What are you doing?" He says, "Oh, there was a knocking on the door. I wanted to see who's there." I said, "It's 2 a.m. There's nobody at the door." "But I heard a knocking." "I have no doubt that you heard a knocking, but I assure you there's nobody there." So when I was there a couple of weeks ago, I would take a shower at night, and in the white noise of the shower, as in the babbling of a brook, I started to hear voices sometimes sounding like my father's voice, so I'd wonder if he maybe had gotten up. This vigilance, again at work, and plotting shapes and in sounds and in randomness. So there is a, you might remember a few years ago there was a meme, the Laurel Yanni meme. There was a sound and some people heard Laurel and some people heard Yanni. This is a prime example of auditory pareidolia. When I was young, my sister took me to a paranormal market, you know, where you get like your aura photograph. There's people speaking about Atlantean lore, all kinds of new age booths. And there was this one old man selling tapes, literally a book on tape of how to record taped voices of the dead. And this is a phenomenon in English called EVP, electronic voice phenomena. The idea is simple, and this is necromancy 101, folks. You take a radio and you tune it to the white noise between stations. Then you take a recording device and you record it, and then you ask questions to your dearly departed, to your dead grandmother, John Lennon. John Lennon's easier to reach through a radio, but you take your pick. And you leave spaces between, and then when you listen back on the recording, you'll start hearing shapes inside the sound. You'll start hearing voices, maybe answering your question. Again, a demonic interface that prompts what you need to hear or want to hear to the foreground. Now, I reimagined EVP as elemental visual phenomenon, because when I'm out in the world, everywhere I look, I see beings, entities. I see personality. I see parts of me that want to tell me something or show themselves or be seen or be acknowledged so that I can get into full expression. Examples. The roots here are strangly and strange, like a sensual serpent's embrace. But if you hug back, you might not end up a snack, and it might even teach you its ways. These just are the slightest embellishments, slightest touches that I've added to it so that you can see what I see. Here we have a very sad, unfortunate palm reading. Here we have a stroll along the trail of tropical trolls. The trippy trail of tropical trolls, I should say. Here is what happens when you gaze into the abyss and it gazes back. Lovingly, exchanging loving and gazes with the abyss. And then this is what happens when the green man gets trapped in barbed wire in the city, you know? Who hasn't felt like that out here? I am just some nature spirit lost in this maze. This is plotted in my outdoor bathroom in my jungle cabin. There's always somebody watching you take a shit out there, you know? There's just no way, even if the architect is not a pervert, there's always someone, yeah. They know what I'm talking about. So, okay, we're going to go back in time to the year 2000. Does anybody remember that bit by Conan O'Brien? In the year 2000. Now, before your time. It's all right. It's all right. This thing on? All right. So, in the year 2000, I had moved to the United States. Shortly after, you know, no, this was before. Yeah, okay, I just moved to the United States. And I had become interested from Amsterdam in cannabis, smoking cannabis, because I arrived in South Florida, I felt isolated, and some thespians took me in. And I loved hanging out with them and smoking weed, and then they would turn to the TV and watch Comedy Central or play video games, and I saw a piece of paper and a pencil, and I started drawing. Because like now the marriage of cannabis and artistry like opened up a whole new world. I started doing portraits of my friends with their interiority splayed around them. So I was kind of like greeting them and then making impressions of that, and I got real turned on by this, folks. I really felt it, you know, and I wanted to explore this further. And at the time, I had been watching Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas. You know? So I thought the whole Fear and Loathing thing looked like a fun time. So I wanted to go back to Amsterdam and try some psychoactive mushrooms. Now, you know, I was from Amsterdam, so it's pretty common reality down there. But nobody ever really talked about any of the stuff that we're talking about now or that this place is built around. Like the closest thing I had to somebody talking about their experiences was my friend who loved his mother and obviously had issues with his father who wanted him to be a man. So it's like, you know, like always going to the gym, always working out, but really like a softie at heart, but hanging out with these tough guys. And then he liked hanging out with me because I was just like myself, you know. And then he would do drugs with his friends and he would come back to me and he'd be like, yeah, we did these shrooms and there was really something like there was a moment in there, we were there and this little gnome came up to me and like hit me on the hand with a hammer and I pulled it away like that and then we all laughed. But there's really something there, you know. And like one time I almost walked into a train and my friend pulled me back, but there's something there and I don't know if he wasn't smart enough or brave enough or whatever it was, but he couldn't find any way to grasp his experience, but there was something there. This is all I knew, so I was thinking, oh cool, it's like smoking weed, and then maybe like a hallucination comes up to you, and you can easily discern that as being a hallucination. Maybe a dwarf will tap you on the hand with a hammer, and that's that. Let's do it! So I ate 28 fresh grams of mushrooms, which is the equivalent of 5 dried grams, but I did not take them in silent darkness. I took them in the middle of Amsterdam, and I downed them with a can of Coca-Cola that advertised always below its name. Within 10 minutes or so, we're sitting there on the steps of an old church, we're munching this strange forbidden fruit, and a couple of cops on bicycles show up. And they start chatting with us, and they say, these little containers, these are yours? We're like, oh no, we don't know what are these anyway? It's like, I don't know, probably some fruit containers or something. Do you mind throwing them away for us? And we're like, yeah, sure, no problem. Strange fruit indeed. 10 minutes after that, we're walking through this tunnel, and I'm feeling the cool, damp embrace of the shadows wrapping around us as I feel the intensity and the sensitivity, twisting the knob, twisting the dial, and there's some small talk, because this is what humans do when we're faced with the infinite. We try to quantify it. So somebody says, wow, it's really dark. And the other one goes, how dark do you think it is? And I go, 30. And they, what? 30 dark. And we get to the other side of the tunnel, and like a birth canal, there's the city, and the city is just like out of control, man. Like, who is in control of this thing? Who is conducting this orchestra? There's like the Doppler effect, sirens going by, and I'm just feeling this, like, the world is drifting out of control. I'm like a caveman, you know, like I've like regressed to this primal, earlier state, and I'm now facing the world of modern artifact that I have thought my whole life was the world. Like, Amsterdam has always existed. This is the way it's always been. This is reality. Hey, do normal. This is what the Dutch say. Act normal. Say, do normal. That's crazy enough. Well, the normal was wearing off, and we walked past this. There's like these blackout moments, you know? So there's that moment, and then like, whoop, whoop. The next moment, I'm staring at this poster that has this silver face extending from it. I'm like, wow, that is incredible. How did they do that? And I look behind me, and the others are just standing there like... And one of them says, yeah, that happens sometimes when people are tripping. And I'm like, what? You don't see this? Something is awry. And so anyway, fast forward a little bit. We're walking down these streets again, and this is kind of where it goes. This is where I know my mind has made has wired itself wrong, has drawn a false conclusion from something. A woman in red walks past me, swans past me, just like all energy moving towards her. I'm just like, wow. She swans past me, I turn around, she smiles at me. It seems like she's like an extra in my life. And this is what I say. I say, this can't be right if this is like Schindler's List. The obvious conclusion to make is the Matrix, but I went because I'm a Dutch Jew and I have some ancestral trauma from old WW2, so that reared its head. And for this phenomenon, this is also like quixotification, you know, like Don Quixote not being able to tell the media from the reality. I call this synesthesia, but not like synesthesia, which a commonly known effect of psychedelic inebriation is synesthesia, the cross-wiring of the senses, smelling colors, seeing sounds. But a lesser known effect is what I have termed synesthesia, C-I-N-E, which is the blending and blurring of the lines between reality and cinema. As a cinephile, this was my fate, it seems. So later on in that trip, I decide I want to go look for a friend of mine who I know has left to fly to New York the day before, but I think in this reality, perhaps he is still here. So I go out looking for a light. That was the first thing. I was looking for a light, very symbolical, and I get into the street, and the street is overwhelming, so I do what any human would do. I check my watch. Maybe this will help, but that it's 9 o'clock means nothing to me now, and I can't really make sense of it. And a little voice comes to my head, and it goes, "En dit is dan dus leven." It was in Dutch, which means, "And then so this is life." And then I put my hand in my pocket, and I hear my knuckles crackling, and I think I broke my hand, and I look, and it goes, "En dit is dan illusie." And then so this is illusion. And then I decide to go towards my friend who might have the answers to what's going on. And when I hit the main street and I see this pixelated swath of humanity, just this like the screen doesn't even come close, but there were no longer individuals, there was just circumstances and emotion, and everything was bleeding into everything else. 1 million languages were being spoken, none of them decipherable, and it was like the sound of Babel boiling me out of my body. And I shot out of my body, like as my vantage point gets higher and higher and higher, the screen gets wider and wider and wider, and a voiceover comes on and it goes, "Imagine a man who desperately felt the need to take psychedelics, exposing him to the reality we've been trying to protect him from his entire life." The music wasn't there, but it was implied. Anyway, after that, I felt basically like I went to hell. I don't ever need to do that again. Fear and loathing sounds fun, but when you look at it, fear, loathing. Over time, I mapped my way through trial and error, joy and terror to set and setting. And that helps a great deal. But the conclusion, I couldn't wrap my head around, just like my friend who couldn't quite let it go. But he couldn't quite wrap his head around it. I warped my head around it, and I found this conclusion, that if poisoning the brain can cause the body to alter and distort reality, then reality as we perceive it must be co-created or manufactured in the brain. So these were like the roots of what I've now uncovered through pareidolia as a demonic interface, this notion that reality, which I thought was an objective thing, is just objectified, like the woman in red walking past as some icon for me, an extra in my life. Schindler's List. So that brings us to, first of all, let me introduce you to my friend Samir. Samir is a painting that I made of a little psychonaut. This is him as an effigy. And then if you pour your essence, this is the idea of sympathetic magic. A lot of cultures have this, like in Japanese culture you have the dogu, which is a little clay figurine, and it is said to, if you're sick or you've got some bad juju, you take the dogu and it absorbs it, and then you smash it like a cashed out piggy bank, and gone is all your problems. Well, in this case, you pour your essence into Samir, and then he is the one that travels to the astral for you. So he's kind of like an astral ambassador. I just figured he looked good here, and I wanted you guys to meet him. The next level of understanding this crazy, wild notion of mine is the twofold aleatoric organization and the divine design. Aleatoric is a fancy word to say chance-based. the chance-based organization. It sounds like an organization, you know, that you like a psychedelic bureaucracy, but it's really just the way the world is organized. It's a mess. The stars up there even are a mess. So it's the algorithm of randomness, and then in association with the divine design, which is your mind magnetizing meaning in accordance with your explorations, this creates the tension of reality that we navigate through. So these ideas of like you create your own reality, it's true, but I'd say you co-create your own reality, because even now, as all of your eyes fall upon me and as my words reassembled in your mind with some semblance of consensual meaning, there's still a very disparate landscape of interpretations that somehow intersect, and the intersecting grid of perspectives creates what we call reality. So, brings us to the divine designs. A lot of these were Caracolabs, collaborations with other denizens of Caracolabs. A lot of them I did by myself, but some of them Alexa made beautiful watercolors that I started seeing things in, and that's kind of what jump-started the whole process. My girlfriend, now ex-girlfriend, Rosa, who I lived with in the jungle for 1.5 years until our amicable parting a few months ago, she did a lot of these watercolors that I then plotted forms in, which the collaborative element is very appealing to me because it supersedes my limitations. You know, different compositions, different colors prompt different ideas and different characters to the forefront, and in some way it's like following their tracks, their emotional impulses, and finding the harmony, the overwhelming and collective harmony in those things. So this is what the aleatoric organization looks like. I don't know if you guys see anything in there yet. Like, take a moment and see if you see something. Don't get attached to it, because 3, 2, 1, gone. It is now peopled. And this is kind of, this is a good example of the aleatoric organization of the floor in my cabin. And you can see, you know, the line of the nose, like all these things. I'm just literally tracing into existence what is already there, potentially. And here you get to see it in action. This was a tiny little painting that Rosa had left laying around, and as I walked past it one night, I saw these forms, and so I immediately decided to trace them into existence. And it's probably one of my favorite ones that I've done, just for how quaint, and I love the colors in it as well. It's so quaint, and I love the colors in it as well. Quite satisfying, isn't it, watching it come into being like that? That's digitally done, you know? That's digital magic, like that. Here's another one. This is the floor plan. Again, a very quixotic landscape. The characters in there, some of them, like this guy, they kind of remind me of Don Quixote. And you'll see, like in a moment, you'll see me trying something, and then it doesn't work, and then I just, like, it can erase it. See, we're gone, and then there he comes back. Perfect. Perfect. And then you can isolate it like that and make coloring books even, which I have not done yet. These are some of the perverts that watch me shower.
Yeah, get the butthole. Yeah, clean it real good.
Okay, gone a little further in time beyond my initial transcendental blast off. Now the towers have fallen. I decided not to move to New York, not to go study film. I decided I had had my taste of psychedelics. I had fallen in love for the first time. My heart and mind were wide open, and I needed to figure some things out. So I moved back to Amsterdam with an American girlfriend at the time who was a kindred spirit, an incredible artist and musician. And we were lucky enough to be given an anti-squat. We were property guardians in an old dentist practice, which we turned into a transcendentist practice. We had 3 stories, 15 rooms. The bottom level was kind of out of the picture. There was a broken mirror and a dead pigeon in the boiler room. The whole house had this feeling of like The Shining meets Fight Club. The attic, we didn't go up there. There were jars of like old crowns, you know, teeth, molds, and things like that. So we had 2 stories left. One of them I had my atelier, my like studio. She had her studio. We had a bedroom, a little kitchen. And one night I got some LSD. My wife Allison and I, 37 years ago, did some LSD. And so we did some LSD. And I had been wandering through the maze of Amsterdam, and I'd been seeking, man. I'd been seeking answers. Answers to questions, answers to words. I wanted to understand the meaning behind words. I wanted to know, God, what does that mean, you know? Fairies. Okay, there's a word for it. There must be some reality to it. I wanted to know about past lives. Like, is that a real thing? Is that just like some kind of genetic memory pool that we splash around in? Or is there an I that somehow was Napoleon another time? I had all these questions, and I was wandering through the labyrinth of Amsterdam, through the maze of Amsterdam, and you'd meet other maze dwellers. Some of them who say they have answers, like these Hare Krishnas that have been kicked out of the Hare Krishnas for stealing books that they're trying to sell to you now. And so they regaled me with their stories about Krishna. I was reading a lot of Buddhist texts. Jehovah's Witnesses would wake us up on the weekend to try and sell their infinity, their eternity to us. And I really liked the Tao Te Ching because it didn't put a face on any of it, and it kept it nice and vague and riddly, the way I liked it. You know what I'm talking about, Venus. So, that fateful night in the transcendentist practice, I was sitting opposite my girlfriend from one moment to the next, and we were crying. Are we crying? Are we crying? And she smiled, and in that moment it was like I saw her. The curtain parted, and then just like that, she had these dangling earlobes and this like man bun, and she looked like the Buddha. Now she had a blue face, and I was staring at Krishna. Now she had a big beard and long hair, and I was looking at Jesus Christ, and that was too much for me. Jesus Christ! And I pulled away, and my mind swirled through this polarity spiral, through this cosmic washing machine, and all the pieces fell into place. And the question that my mind had been asking, like, why did I just see a bearded face where my girlfriend's face is supposed to be? It basically answered in like an instant. You've been looking around for these answers. These are the masks that it wears. And I was like, what is behind the masks? And it was like this. And the room was filled with this like strands of colorful, creative energy that felt like it had been there from the unborn beginning until the undying end. And I was like, oh, creative energy. Yeah, I call that God. And I opened up and I let it inside, and I felt a rush of inspiration like I'd never felt before. And I picked up a paintbrush. And a piece of plasterboard that I had snatched off the street, and I started to paint. Now I didn't know what I was painting. I was just putting the brush down, and at times the trails would get ahead of my brush, and I was tracing the lines into existence. And every time I doubted what I was doing and wondered, what am I creating, a wave of energy with the linguistic aura that said, trust, washed over me, and I kept going. And by the end of it, I was gazing into this painting, which to me was like this perfect Krishna-like self that's holding this nauseated ego at bay with this kind of jackal figure as its third eye is opened and it's staring into this vortex of unified duality. And so I had the sense that this painting had always existed, that this painting was like stored in a repository in eternity, and it was my job to realize it, to liberate it into time. And these were ideas that I worked with for a long time, because I used to think of it like the archetypes in the unconscious collective in some repository in eternity, which is still a very vague concept that speaks of some other place, some other time, something other than this. And so I started thinking a lot about time and the idea of retrocausation, the notion that if the future exists, if there is a me in the future, then this is the me in the future of a past, so I can communicate backwards in time and make sure that I can make it to this moment. So all of you here are safe right now, and you can communicate that back to yourselves to ensure that you are here. This is called a time loop. This is how you close the time loop, is by making it actual. And you can find these things through dreams. You can find little glimpses of it. And this guy, Eric Wargo, who wrote a book called Time Loops and a book called Precognitive Dream Work and the Long Self, he talks about how these dreams oftentimes are not dreams of the actual events, but of the associations we have when we encounter these events. A newspaper article about 9/11, for instance, rather than the actual crumbling of the towers. So keep your eyes out for these things. These are some paintings that, years later, this is where we went from this to this through like many internal journeys and mappings and psychoactive voyages. This one is called Safe Passage. That one is called The Synesthetic Aesthetic, or The Sound Vision. But still, you can see I'm still very timid with how many characters I'm curating in here. The borders aren't entirely open. I'm still trying to represent my work in a certain fashion. These are called bakuim. That's the fictitious Hebrew plural of the Japanese mythological character, the Baku, which are the dream eaters. If you wake up, you don't remember your dream, the Baku ate them. I found out that there is also a place called the Baku Bazaar where they hog tie them and gut them, and you can buy your dreams back from the dream merchants. Keep your eyes out for that one, folks. This is called in-depth perception, because it's kind of a non-Euclidean space. There's similar to the sound in the jungle. I couldn't tell how far away or close it was. It's a kind of different dimensionality. And here we're starting to lean more towards the pareidolic dimensions coming to the forefront. Then remember this year, right? 2020. I was living in Los Angeles. I wasn't having a great time. I felt really isolated. It was really just like hard. Life was hard. And then COVID, Saint COVID came around and liberated us from that. So I gave up I put all my belongings in storage, and I went to take care of my father in Florida for 8 months. And then after that, I was ready to go find home again. And I visited all the places I used to call home. LA, San Francisco. I visited places that I hadn't called home yet. I went to Oregon, I went to Arizona, visited homies, but I couldn't find home. I called this tour the Great American Location Scout, because everywhere I went it felt like a location scout, and so I started making these films, these music videos. This was a collaboration with a musician named Sorn. Those are with an artist named Balladeer. This was for my friend Alexa Mello. I had bought this camera from one of Bjork's cinematographers who did a video called The Gate and a video for The Weeknd called Blinding Lights. It wasn't the camera he'd used for that, but he was a cinematographer I admired, and I only found out after I bought the camera from him that it was his, so it felt like a real blessing. Unfortunately, the camera was stolen later on, but these are some of the projects I made with that, and I started creating these kind of like animate effects to bring more of the inner world to the foreground in a kind of a psychedelic revelation, And a lot of what I do is I like to work with my surroundings and with the genius loci or resident spirit of a place. So even here in the city, it's like the stain spotting is like a way for me to speak to the energies that reside within a place, and even more so in like a natural environment. And so I spent this time in the desert, and in the desert I found this piece of a saguaro that looked like a perfect Rorschach face. Like if you look at it, it's grinning at you, but there's no face there, so it very much fit my aesthetic, and I used that for one of the videos, which was very much like a communication with this desert landscape. As we were shooting, sometimes a particular spot would light up naturally with this kind of, you feel pixie-led, they call it, you know? It's like the idea of, I talked about earlier, of like fairies. Timothy Leary once pointed out that what today we call fairies, what today we call photons, we used to call fairies. So you just got to find the meaning of it, and this idea of being pixie-led is something very real. It's just like a glow of significance lights up in a particular space, and especially if you're on a creative conversation with a place, this is huge, and you only have a moment to capture that. So I told my friend, slap on the saguaro mask and get amongst the prickles, and we're gonna get this shot. And then this was at my friend Soren's house. He was unaware that the ram skull over his door cast itself a shadow body, where the light perfectly lights up at the heart of the home. And that brings us to Caracol Labs, Casa Caracol and the Eternal Snail Convention. In 2004, I wrote this story called The Eternal Snail Convention that came to me. One line came, like it was an idea I had toyed with, but I hadn't written anything down, and one line came and the whole thing arrived. I had never published it. I only went around and shared it in the oratory, storytelling, bardic tradition. And wherever I went, something miraculous would happen. The first time I told it was in a hotel room to a bunch of hippies, and they looked at me with wide eyes, and afterwards one of them reached in their pocket and pulled out a little knit snail finger puppet and gave it to me. During this time in the pandemic, looking for home, I decided to give it another go and try to make snail illustrations. So I started making, these are some examples, illustrations of snails. Snail illustrations, you see? Yes. And, you know, this thing evolves at a snail's pace, so it has to take its time. And right then, Miss Nine Lambs, Miss Alexa Cassil, who had heard me on a podcast and had reached out to me, had reached through the seeming barrier of, you know, podcast world, screen world, and had reached out to me and said, I'm coming to LA, let's grab tea, you seem cool. We grabbed some tea, we got along, we kept in touch, and now she put out an advertisement on Instagram saying, hey, does anybody want to come create in a snail-shaped house in the jungle in Mexico? A no-brainer, and not just because snails don't have brains, but my vision was high, my feelers were out. I was like, I'll go check it out. I wasn't thinking that, you know, I was going to be there for long. I booked a ticket, I was going to be there for a month, and I was going to go to Mexico City, hang out with my sister for a couple of weeks, and continue my search for home. But the world had different plans in store for me. This is when I arrived at Casa Caracol. Before I entered into the space, I just saw the shadows of people moving around in there. I'd been told there was a Mexican artist named Richie who had magical interests and with whom I would probably get along. There was an orange man named Wes who manages rappers and travels around all over the place. And that's really all I knew. So I stood for a moment and took in this piece of surreal architecture with these sounds going around, by the way. Frogs, man. I wanted to learn all the local dialects, you know? I wanted to learn it all. And so I entered into the space. This is it looking out from that same door, night and day. There is Alexa's behind. Just like a very amazing, surreal vibe. And like every day I would wake up. Like I said, for probably a lot of us, it was a dark time, this pandemic. There was a lot of uncertainty, you know, we'd really gone through the ringer. But every morning I would wake up and I'd be excited to hang out with, well, Wes had taken off by then. He was only there for like the first 2 days. But I wanted to hang out with Alexa and with Richie, and I wanted to create, and I wanted to eat tacos. You know, I was dreaming about tacos. It was just like, life was coming back. You know that feeling? And I was like, it was hard to admit at first, but I had to admit to myself I was feeling happy again, which I hadn't really felt or been able to admit fully. I was feeling happy, and I started to acclimatize to the idea of staying. This is near the end of it. There was a wooden Indiana Jones bridge there, which Rosa and I, one night, we were on it when it collapsed, and I hung there like Rambo, like Stallone in Cliffhanger by one arm, as she was trying to save me, and I said, get back or the whole thing will collapse, and then it did. The bridge wasn't the only thing we were on that night, we were also on acid. And again, to bring in this precognitive idea, earlier that night I felt possessed by 100 Maori warriors. I was just like manically stomping around. And I was like running up towards the wall and then grabbing where the hammock was clasped into the wall and doing the 1960s Batman walking up the wall thing and then holding on. And I'm not like a climber, you know. But later that night when the bridge collapsed and I hung there like that, I thought about it later and I was like, was I priming my grip for that moment that was to come? So there were no, it feels like there are no surprises if you're paying attention. And that's what divination is, you know? It's summoning omens through intention and attention. Instead of waiting around for some divine sign, you keep your eyes out for the divine design. And that brings us to this little guy. During my ayahuasca experiences, I would often come across these kind of interdimensional drones. Now, the word drone is a pun. It's a drone as in like a bee or a wasp or some kind of insect drone, but it's also a drone as in it's made of sound. And a drone as in a surveillance tool. It felt like these are like the surveillance ambassadors of the overmind or something like that. And there was always, when I'd come across them, this feeling of, like this invasive feeling, this like penetrating your defenses, seeing through into you and seeing more than you're willing to reveal. Well, right before I went to Mexico, I booked my ticket, I had about a week left. I arrived at a friend's place where I was going to stay until I left. And I didn't do the set and setting thing, folks. Let this be a cautionary tale. I arrived, I ate a bunch of steak, you know, filled up my belly with it. I thought we were going to do it at the full moon. Turns out the full moon was that night. So I ate, it was maybe like 2 grams, but they were really strong, man. Really strong mushrooms. And at some point in there, this one, almost like an emblem, like this little pog, like this little circular emblem of a lion is starting to come towards me. And then I realized that this thing is hovering by the sidelines with its many eyes. And it's like slinks away as I see it. And I felt terrified because it was made up of all these omens. The feeling of violation, the feeling of like being violated, being robbed, being invaded in all ways. It was like it left me with this real dis-ease, you know, for the days to come. But I had some time to prepare. So I spent that week like really like processing it. I created myself an outfit so that I could fit in with the locals. This is like this was alebrije wear. Are you guys familiar with alebrijes?
Yeah.
This is where we get into like folkloric dimensions.
What?
The alebrijes of Mexico started with this piñata maker named Pedro Linares, who one night in like a fever dream or something got flooded by all these colorful little hybridized creatures that proclaimed themselves to be alebrijes, 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 alebrijes. And he came back and he was like, alebrijes, alebrijes. And he started making them out of paper mache, and later they started making little woodcut creatures. And this is like a big export now in like souvenirs in Oaxaca, Mexico. So I decided to make this alebrije wear, and you can see like the very woody, like fearful, kind of like tense physique, but this gave me like the idea of like being able to sense with my skin or with my thought helmet. And then I arrived, and it turned out that Richie was an incredible alebrije maker. And so instantly I had this sense, like when I arrived and I felt safe and I learned that the people I was with were very kindred spirits, like a spirit family that I had landed with, I felt that the drone that I had encountered was myself cast back in time to tell me, I found a place where you are safe, just beyond the event horizon, just beyond the threshold of who you are now. There is a new you waiting for you and you are happy. And I was like, get away from me, you're terrifying! And Richie had been working on this idea of alebrije wear, this idea of like these clothes that I had just designed, and in the verb alebrijar, which is like to alebrij, you know, And so I considered him an alebrujo, like a alebrije brujo. This is the space, all right, just to give you the vibe of the inside of Casa Caracol. And I had lit it up the way I would my film shoots. There's this phenomenon called Cotard syndrome. It's when you feel like you don't exist or like you are dead. And sometimes it felt like this was this cosmic bardo. And if you don't know yet that you don't exist or that you're dead, you're going to have certain preoccupations in the border zone. For Richie, it was solving the chess labyrinth. For Alexa, it was her preoccupation with time, so she filled a hourglass with time crystals in order to meditate on that.
That's ketamine.
Incredimine!
Time ketamine.
So it was a magical place. This is my Gaspar Noé moment, a little enter the void, outer body experience. Richie also makes incredible masks. It's kind of nice with this bent in the screen. These amazing masks. And then this is some footage from a cave that felt like the interior of my soul, just like this pareidolic dream world filled with bats. And bats are like my allied fear, so it felt so nice to see them just dropping from the ceilings where they hung like little skin tags and then dip and dive so harmoniously and free. So I really felt like I had arrived home. I had this film idea that was starting to develop. Like I felt like these are the spaces. So maybe it wasn't even a film idea, but a precognitive glimpse of a place, because most of the time I live the films I wanted to make. Okay, here we get into... Is everybody still enjoying this, by the way? Is everybody on board with this? Okay.
Y'all happy? Wait.
Does anybody need to take a sip of water? Because I do.
Do you need water? You got water? You're doing great.
I'm the Statue of Liberty.
We're on Instagram Live.
Oh, wow. Oh, wow.
It's a big deal.
Well, all right. So, this idea of raising the dead for a living was something that came up when I did this Scottish rap persona a while back. I had this album called Seance Fiction. And one of the lyrics in one of the songs is, plug into the earth, you get culture shocked. Yes! The lizard laugh track, the giggling gecko cascading from the corner of the room, always punctuating at the right moments.
Who is it?
In the jungle sitcom. So, plug into the earth and get culture shocked is again gets down to this like idea of the original thought, the origins of culture, the vortex of mystery around which we gather as though it were a campfire and share stories and make dances and build effigies and religions. And Mckenna used to talk about it like the transcendental object at the end of time, and you can think of this as a cosmic disco ball that sends these refractions throughout time, and it appears over here as some great guru, and there as a great work of literature, or a great souffle. And so, this is what I call the immanent nature of culture. Immanent meaning it's already inside and it's coming out. It's actually the immanent nature, the idea that the culture is waiting in the soil, and that the genius loci is the representative of this expression. And so our attitudinal expressions towards this mystery find their expression through a particular flavor of the place and time. This is a painting I did in 2003 when I had just been introduced to ayahuasca, and I had gone to Brazil. And this was a vision in which the entity ayahuasca appeared to me as a little Taurus. That's how I interpreted it, as a little Taurus, but people started looking at it and saying, it's mezcalito, or it's a coyote. And people said, that reminds me of the art of the huicholes of Mexico. And I didn't know any of these things, but that's the transdimensional cultural influence that when you plug into the soil through these particular plant-based substances, or naturally. Some people don't even need it because it's there, the soil is there. You can connect with it by getting your hands dirty, or through dream, or breath work, or dance, or any other way. But so I started getting the sense that these different cultures are tapping into the same thing, and they're just dressing it up in different ways.
Wait, can we buy that? How much is
That one, I only have prints of that one. That's what, there's like a few paintings.
Where's the original?
I have the original, but there's like
How
a few,
much?
this one is not for sale. There's a few pieces that are just like,
Everything's for sale.
You're gonna have to kill me first.
We want it.
That's the
don't kill me first.
We're gonna kill you.
Okay, so
Don't make it come to
there
that.
there is a painting coming up
What's
in a
your
moment.
painting?
This is funny because like somebody asked about this painting that you'll see in a little bit. Somebody walked into my room and he happened to be a Brazilian quantum physicist, and he says, "Wow, this painting looks really expensive." And I said, "Expansive?" And he goes, "No, like expensive, like it costs a lot of money." I said, "Well, how much would you think it's worth?" And he goes, "Oh, let me see. I think this painting is worth an equation that measures an unknown force." So that's the price on it. So, cha-cha-cha-cha-changa, time to face the strange. Cha-cha-changa. Changa, jungle spice. The plant-based DMT substance that you can smoke. It's slightly gentler, slightly prolonged. One night we smoked it from an apple. An apple. There's Richie, my rendition of his interior blasting off. He had a vision, I think, of a particular like Rorschach fractal mask coming at him that he wanted to turn into a real mask. And then when it was my time to blast off, Saltomonte Icarus showed up, this little big boy, as I call him, little big boy. This old grasshopper couldn't keep his little paws away from the flames, and he would just keep going close to it, and then he'd touch it, and then he'd go, "Oh!" And then like a farmer, like waving his fist at the villagers, he'd go, "Oh, you come again," and then he'd do it again, "Oh!" So I saw that as an omen. I was like, okay, go in, but don't fly too close to the sun. I don't want little wax gloves like this guy. And what happened was, as soon as I smoked it, I felt like I became the grasshopper. I felt 6 pairs of arms, and I started doing these passes that felt kind of like the Baphomet. But when I start, you know the Baphomet? It's like a Gnostic demon. He's as above, so below, pose like this kind of thing.
Oh, magician.
Do it again. Slower. Yes.
Yes.
The Instagram.
Without the face expression.
Can't go without the face. More face jokes, remember? So, when I started rendering an impression of this experience, it no longer looked like the grasshopper. It looked like the Xolo dog, Xoloto, who is Quetzalcoatl's little twin brother and the guide to the underworld, much like Anubis. So here was all of a sudden this Baphomet, Anubis, Xolotl. This is where the same creature showed up. This is like a local dog, you know? Like a dog with a mohawk, usually like completely hairless. And so again, I got this sense of like, I'm getting to know the culture from the inside out. And in the sense of Eric Wargo's ideas about precognition, it was, you know, this is how I would learn about things, is I'd have the experience, I'd research it, and then when you learn more through your research, it's actually leaking back and forming the experience. So me learning about Xolotl and about Cholo dogs and Anubis and the correlations between it, this is actually seeping back in time, and that's what's creating this channeled vision. Like, I don't even think of it as a channel because it seems like it's coming from somewhere else, but I think of it as being possessed by process, where I am just another moving part in this thing realizing itself from the vaults of eternity, or actuating itself along these space-time coordinates where it's always existed. Isn't that comforting, that we will always exist in these space-time coordinates together in this moment? That we will always have this moment?
You guys excited?
God, that's a nice feeling. And I'm so glad to share it with you all.
I'm excited.
So again, working with the environment, just like the artisans in the town near where I lived work a lot with these like wicker materials and local woods and things like that. So I also like to co-create with that. So this is a wicked, witchy, wicker deity that I brought to the foreground, and that is the Princess Queen, made from a local coconut and a spray-painted piece of wood that I think Alexa and Richie had decorated originally. And as the story, when we were living at Qualia, as the story evolved, so each time this avatar would become a different expression. Like there was a time when there had been a robbery, and again, this was the second level of this vision of the drone becoming a reality, my fear becoming a reality. But in this case, we had been robbed, but we lassoed a time loop around them. We tracked them down. Wesley did some of his magic and bribed some local cops and set up a sting operation, and we brought them to justice. It then also turned out, of course, that they had a bunch of guns on them and missing passports and were possibly tied up with a local murder. So I think we did a good thing there, folks. But again, it was this fear that had become an actualization and somehow overcome so that we could live to tell the tale. But during that time, the Princess Queen became much more fiery and combative looking. Here again we have, this is the head. Bring me the head of the Princess Queen. So I love the idea of finding these expressions of, say, spirits, which may not even be there except as an idea that we then bring into actuation so that we may interact with them into the world. Folkloric dimensions. So I've already touched onto this a lot, but when I was a kid, my father, who worked as a director of a Norwegian plasterboard company, would often bring me back these ugly little woodcut trolls, which are like distinct souvenirs. They're like the alebrijes of Norway. And when I went to Norway and walked through the woodlands, I could feel this presence there, and probably because it's the same Norwegian wood, just realized that now. But that was such a strong impression for me, that the landscape radiates a particular folkloric presence and aesthetic. This was, these are Ritchie's pieces where he has spray painted canvases and then melted crayons in the sun. And then I took pictures of them and I turned them into these embodiments. Earlier I told you about the Baku, the dream eaters of Japanese folklore. This is an eviscerated Baku, so that is me reclaiming dreams and parts of myself that I had lost pre-pandemic and during the pandemic and was now reclaiming. And this one is the impression, if you look here, you can see the purge. Because one night we were all hanging out in the snail house, and I was feeling a little off, and the stone walls of the snail house started turning into faces in my malaise, and one of them just looked at me, and it seemed to say, "It is time." And I got up and I went to the bathroom, and I purged, and I purged, and I purged, and then I felt a lot better. But so this is the expression of that. And that night there was a lot of kind of substantial dissonance around the house. There was a lot of discombobulated energy, people on different substances. I took a heroic dose of MDA, and I still can't tell you a lot about it. Nobody got that one?
Woo!
All right. But it's funny because then Rosa, who was my girlfriend for a year and a half in the jungle, I hadn't met her yet. She had written to me because she found my music. She heard me on a podcast. She written to me. I wrote her back. She lived in Argentina. Suddenly she sent me a message saying that she had a dream that we were sailing through an orange mist. Mind you, we're living in the land of the Orange Man here. On a ship cruising through a storm, and we were sailing the ship through the storm. And I was like, well, when did you dream this? Because we just had this energetic tempest storming through the house where the next day the water didn't work, the car wouldn't start, you know, like all this kind of stuff. Toilets wouldn't flush, you couldn't see anybody poop. And so she was like, yeah, that was that night. So I invited her to come join us in Xilitla, in a rainforest 8 hours away from Mexico City, where she happened to be free at the time and felt adventurous and came out there for Amy's birthday, which was a big gathering of wizardly folks, and then we were together for a year and a half after that. So again, like, everybody was following these kind of precognitive glimpses to this vortex, this spiral vortex of the snail house. And That's why I called it Villa Precognito. That brings us to the folkloric dimensions of Mexico, the beings known as chaneques among the Aztecs and alushas among the Maya. This is a chaneque, those are alushas. They're kind of akin to gnomes, or the Spanish idea of the duende, which are like little elf-like, gnome-like, troll-like beings. In the Mexican folklore, they're often considered like little people or like little children with an old person's face. They sometimes are considered like golems, where people make an effigy and then the effigy disappears, and that's how they know it has become alive. And after 7 years of it protecting the land, you have to seal its dwelling place, otherwise your crops will spoil or that sort of thing, or you get bad luck, or they turn evil. All these kinds of ideas. So the face that I'd seen on the wall to me was like the alusha, telling me it's time to go purge. And I learned about these through Richie, who was very interested in the Mexican folklore. But again, I was encountering these things through the pareidolic demonic interface. Because look at these creatures, and then these are the creatures in my bathroom, dwelling in there. So we're very much in Mexico, you know what I mean? Like the inner Mexico here. And again, this was a tablet along the road. I don't know if this is like a replication of a codex or something like that, but just the quality, the aesthetic quality of these characters with their strange hats are the same things that would show up in the walls of Casa Caracol. And then you have the Nahual. If anybody has read Carlos Castaneda, you know this as kind of like a shape-shifting sorcerer, and they have these animal spirits known as tonals. Richie made it very clear that a lot of the alebrijes sold on the marketplace are actually tonals, because they're just one animal with psychedelic colors rather than psychedelic amalgams of different animals. And the Nahual is the hidden one, which I see that as the same thing as what Eric Wargo calls the long self, or like I said, like the realized potential, the unconscious, the daemon, the larger part of yourself that already knows the entire story that we are now journeying through one moment at a time. This is a Nahual on the walls in Xilitla with a chaneque staff. That
Buy
just...
it?
Hmm?
People online want to know if they can buy it.
This one, you can't buy it because it's on the wall in Xilitla. You'd have to buy the whole rabbit home.
Yes, you can buy the whole place, but you have to give me a different rabbit home. Okay, yes.
Details.
So in Mexico City, Alexa and Richie had primed a wall in Richie's apartment, and when I walked in, I saw one of the characters pop out. I said, "Can I people it?" He said, "All right." So this became like a whole 2-3 day festival of me pulling characters out and them cheering me on and laughing and creating history surrounding these beings. And it got me so excited about this whole thing that this became kind of like the daily art form for me, because it was something that came so easy. Because things become easier when you take the judgment off, or when you try to constrict your expression to something self-imitating, limited to what you believe yourself to be, and just allow whatever kind of weirdo with however many nipples to come to the forefront and just let them run free. This little guy, he's like, "I don't want this anymore. I thought I wanted it, but I don't want it anymore. That one has too many nipples." There's one that has these stalactites. This guy is right next to the plug. He says, "Psst, plug it in here." This guy's rolling on some Molly. Pet me harder. I don't want this anymore. It's just a lot of weird stuff where usually I would have censored myself and be like, I don't know if I want to lead with that. No, I just don't care. It's just fun, And then Richie said, "Oh, I love this one. That one I'm going to make into my avatar on WhatsApp." And he's like, "The other one, that one I don't like." I'm like, "You can't pick and choose. The one you don't like is the one that you still need to learn to love and embrace to become full expression." Anyway, this goes on for a while. You can find these online if you'd like. Here's a little dance party.
Oh, actually, all the people online are asking for your Instagram. I said,
Are you still broadcasting to them?
Right there.
Oh, hello, people online. At void_Denison. VOID_DENIZEN. Tag me. Yeah, so this one is for sale. The price of it is
How much?
an equation that measures an unknown force.
Ah! Is that in euros?
What?
Is that in euros? I'm gonna buy it.
In euros.
Even
That is in euros.
So it's your goddamn art.
So this was something I created the first time I smoked dimethyltryptamine. What?
Little money. Yeah.
Money. It's all about money. It's all about money. This is about honey. This is about the sweetness. Anyway, we'll talk money later. This comes afterwards. There's a sales pitch. This is the longest sales pitch ever. People are like, I want to buy it already. I'm like, hold on. I'm still pitching it.
This is your fucking art. We're hungry.
Anyway, I smoked dimethyltryptamine for the first time. I'd already had a lot of experience with ayahuasca.
We'll work for
And
it.
I came upon this space that was like these omnidirectionally helixing coils of serpentine electricity coiling to me, from me, and through me. And I had all these ideas afterwards. Like, it was unlike anything, but when I stepped out of it, I was like, I know that place. That was the same energy as my childhood imaginary friend. That was this moment when I had a fever dream hallucination as a kid. This was that moment in that ayahuasca trip. It was like coins glinting in the wishing well of my past, like this thread coiled throughout my timeline, throughout my biography. And so I did a few different renditions of the painting till I came up with the Merkabah, which is, a mix between the Merkabah, the Kabbalah, DNA, and all that, the chakras. So again, showing how the bleeding mystery congeals through symbols and almost becomes static and can be mined and shelved, but maybe it also, a symbol has meaning behind it, but we want to tap into the felt presence of immediate experience. We want to get beyond the symbols, and we want to find new self-arising symbols, and not a new paradigm, but a paradigm that is eternally in motion. This is the myth pipe Kabbalah, because that's what you smoke DMT out of, a myth pipe, not a meth pipe, a myth pipe.
Myth pipe. Myth
So
pipe.
that was my myth pipe Kabbalah. So I'm a Dutch Jew, but I wasn't raised Jewish. Well, I was raised Dutch, I guess, but I didn't like cheese. Didn't wear wooden shoes. When I started studying for my bar mitzvah, which is, when you become a man, I quit halfway through. Like, I'm half Jewish, Jewish, semi-Semitic. So I ran out of Jewish blood, and I stopped studying for it. I never became a man. But then when I took the mushrooms at 18, that was my rite of passage. And so, in a way, I came to this kind of Jewish mysticism, these ideas, these core tenets, through psychedelic experiences. And then, in order to come to terms with the felt presence of these experiences, I studied, where I could, the internet. And that's how I learned. And so, to commemorate that, I made this mushroom menorah. 8 crazy nights.
Whoa. Mashinora. That's sold?
It's not sold. This
How
one,
much?
this one I
How
might be
many
able to sell.
editions?
I can't do it off the cuff, but if somebody is interested in this one, contact me or contact my my ambassador.
They are. I'm gonna buy everything, so.
I like it.
Go find yourself.
I may live to see another day. Okay, another wild tale that weaves into all this. Is everybody still on board with this, by the way? Can I keep going? All right.
Yeah. Radical consent?
So, after...
We only have 4 people that raise their hand for consent. That's all.
Oh,
Once more.
I guess we're raw dog in this room.
There you go.
Raw
Anyone
godding.
else raise your hands?
I don't get it. Is it because there's dogs?
If you can't raise your hand... Yeah, okay. Everybody's... Enough, the majority is on board.
60%. I'm sorry. Okay, keep going.
Okay, so after this encounter with the Merkabah and this kind of what I called the inhabited material of the meta-real, I got these notions in my head that the human animal, that human nature is this reflective crystalline channel where all of nature, like dominion over the animals, this kind of idea is that our nature is that we reflect everything in the world, and so our nature is borrowing from the world. This is why we have cars that have exoskeletons and call them beetles. This is why we raise towers up like termites do. Why our boats, the pedals of the boats are like the oars are like the fins of fish. So we're doing this kind of like mimicrous. We're robbing nature of its ideas. I once had a Romani gypsy consigliere, and he said that the Romani people, their culture is all stealing. That's how they learn. He says they don't teach you how to ride a horse. You see somebody do it and you steal the way they do it. This is what humanity does. We steal the way nature does things, and then we reverse engineer that into what we call reality, you know, our world. So with these ideas in mind and this notion from the transcendentist practice that I would be able to enter into the vault of eternity and retrieve and realize objects into this world, I was trying to shamanically retrieve a manuscript that I'd been working on. I was looking for just like the raw inspiration with which to realize this thing. What I did not see coming was that I was the thing that needed to be realized, and that I was like a book bound in flesh, a genetic one-liner that needed to unfurl into the world. And so going to the desert, and here we have again the same entity we saw in the earlier painting, but now as a coyote. When I arrived in the desert, I made a mandala out of rocks to kind of work with the land and say hello to the resident spirits. Then I went to sit on the rubbled rock walls and played my didgeridoo, which is of course a Dreamtime instrument from Australia, the oldest wind instrument, and dream drone radio, earth tone dream drone radio is this kind of like porous, rumbling sound, and it felt to me like it was translating the rocks around me. And these coyotes came up and they were like, "What's going on over here? Oh, that's chill. Nice." And then they took off again. But we had this moment where we looked in each other's eyes, and these like Fibonacci sequenced webs, dream catchers were like moving between us. It felt like there was an exchange happening. And the next day we drank some jungle juice, some fresh brew, and it was kind of mild but interesting. And the next day I took a whopping dose of psilocybin mushrooms, and right at the onset I heard the yip, 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 yip from beyond the canyon, and it was the coyotes right at the onset of the trip. And I started laughing and I said, "Oh man, this is gonna be a hell of a trip. They've got a hell of a trip in store for us." My friends and I, we started wandering towards the mountainside, and I noticed that my friend, the same one who had been my girlfriend in the transcendentist practice, she was wandering off on her own path towards other mountains. And so we've got two friends walking in this direction, her just veering off on her own path, and me thinking like, what's going on? And it hit me. The coyotes have set a trap for her and are luring her towards them. I start running like I'm in a summer blockbuster. I'm dodging anvils falling from the sky, dodging landmines. I'm running beyond the point of no return. And when I get to her and I tap her on the shoulder and she spins around, her eyes like fairy enchanted orbs, just sparkles all around her head, I realize that what I'm about to tell her might be completely insane, but I decide I have to deliver it. And I go, where are you going? I think maybe the coyotes are luring you towards certain doom. I don't know. If you need to go, you go. I don't want to hold you up, but we're pretty far away from our friend. I look over the Native American landscape. There's nobody in sight. Our friends are pretty far away, and we don't have any water. And I start walking, and as I start walking, I feel like my gait is influenced by Jim Morrison. We need some water! And now the ocean, or the desert, is starting to turn into an ocean. There are now current channels in the air, shuttling streams of dream. I get clobbered in the head by a passing jellyfish, spin around, drop to the ground, and sit there. And all of a sudden, the visual landscape of the desert becomes unmuted and becomes a soundscape. industrial crackle of the conveyor belt of the desert factory delivering sizzle, snap, crackle, pop. All I want is water, the desert gives me dreams. All I want is water, the desert gives me dreams. It fed me to rivers, it's memories of streams. We don't need no water, the motherfucker burn. And I realized I'm the one making these sounds, but also the sounds were delivered to me through these current channels, almost like pneumatic tubes, shuttling messages through the desert from that rock, from that tree, from that place, through what I would later term metronomes. A metronome, like the rhythm of the water drops right here, holds the beat, holds the measure. But it's also, the way I wrote it was with a G, metronomes, or metrogenomes. A genome is the pocket of information, of genetic material that makes it what it is. There's a genome for a human, a genome for a monkey, a genome for a cactus. My theory was that these sort of embodied beings, they weren't necessarily beings, but fairy folklorist Brian Froud, in what I term Froudian psychology, would talk about how these forms delivered themselves through tangible pulses, which then he would allow to guide his pencil so that these beings would come to live on the page and then would often lead him to their location in the garden. And it was this plant or that plant. So these tangible pulses, I believe, were the genomes of various parts of the desert shuttling themselves to the crystalline vessel of my being, of the storyteller, the bardo bard, because they had eons of sunshine to transmit but had never had anybody to talk to or talk through. And here I was now, the mouthpiece of the desert. And I wasn't like a beatboxer at the time either, but I became like this pranic piston. And the rest of that night was very much a rock opera full of manic, shamanic madness and something kind of like Nightmare Before Christmas or something like that. In the end, I look back at it and there was just a lot of it was megalomaniacal, but the core that I was able to take out of it is that I became the living manuscript, the living word that I had been seeking to place on the page, the Metronomicon. And that brings us back to the divined designs. So the idea I talked about earlier about the nagual, right? The hidden parts of the world, the hybridized creatures. The night that we smoked changa, Alexa's vision I didn't talk about yet, but hers was very much a hybrid between Richie's idea of alebrijes as hybridized creatures and my ideas of like cave art on concrete, pareidolic visions. She said that she saw fully spliced creatures. And she said fully spliced. It wasn't like there's a part of this animal, part of that animal. They were like, the deck was fully shuffled. And when she came out of that experience, she started commemorating it by putting watercolors on paper. And it was so beautiful, and she had such a wonderful sense of color and composition, and it started prompting these like crackling beings to the forefront, these nahuals, you know? And so I asked, can I people this? And she was like, sure. And so the first images came through in this series, I'd say, the Divine Designs. We call him the Surrealtor. How many can I put you down for? And the Surrealtor is very much Richie, who is like he was an architectural dropout who became an artist. He was doing free paintings, which to me at first looked like free paintings that you'd find somewhere, just like, you know, splattering colors on there. But over time I became to really appreciate that as the aleatoric organization, that these were the very grounds from which we can prompt this divine design, harmony, and order. And so you get, this is the dope pope. The dope pope gives us hope. He believes women are people, and he's for gay marriage too. Very progressive fellow. The dope pope gives us hope. Yeah, a lot of creatures are always, you know, this guy's giving me a nose job. A lot of them are humping each other. There's a very much like jungle feel of things clamoring for their existence, consuming each other, blending together, you know, invading each other's spaces. And that is very much also something that comes through in these pieces, I feel, is that the divine design, the aleatoric organization, the characters are all made out of the same substance. It's the same kind of big bang, impulsive, splattering explosion and expression in which they find themselves, in which they find their delineated parts. And so you can see in certain cases, like you'll see it on the walls here in these pieces, how, that one's a good one, it's called When Bodily Boundaries Blur. You'll see how like the pink splatters from one character bleed over in the other, and how in a sense we're always, especially in a city, an urban jungle, influencing each other through sound and through pheromonal transmissions and all kinds of communicative modalities. This was a piece that was stolen the second time that the snail house got robbed. That time I was very hopeful that we would again time loop a lasso, but they were too quick for us. So that was a lesson too in letting go of my beautiful camera that I'd gotten from the Bjork cinematographer and this painting. But this is the one that I just put it in here because I wanted it to have a moment in the world, and also because it's the one where I really realized, like, oh, they're all cut of the same cloth, you know? They're separate and they're diverse in their expressions. Well, I mean, it's stolen. If you catch him and you get it back, it's yours, baby.
I'll kill him.
So this is, there were some bigger pieces that, you know, I wasn't able to bring back from the jungle. This is one of them. It's called Schizo-Friendly Paradise, also known as the TV, because whenever certain people were lysergically altered, they like to stare at it like it was a TV. And this gives you like a little tour of it. It's again, it's an full expression of this journey, you know, of the style and the kind of unbridled expression and embrace of all these shady characters piled up on each other. The real kind of ecological, shamanistic, theurgic orgies of existence. They sure are. This is right after the rain too, so they're like especially, they're raving. Couple of moments with the TV here. One of the best pieces of advice anybody ever gave about viewing my artwork is to look slowly. And the more you look into it, the more you'll get out of it, because it's supposed to set your story plotting machinery in motion. Zoom around, meet the locals, that sort of thing. Learn something about yourself within the oracular orchard of the divine designs. This one is the time scene investigation, which also came about after the first bandits had been apprehended. I mean, that's a story for a whole other night. Not relevant to this, but here, the little tour through that one, which was also too big to carry out of the jungle. And then this was the final Kara collab, artwork made in collaboration with Qualia's snail population. The snail trails on the ground became a literal Kara collab, made at the tail end of my residency at Kara Collabs, a fate intimately tied up with my oratory storytelling of the eternal snail convention. A bard speaks in slime-time tongues. And so, to close out this ceremony, I want to share with you the eternal snail convention. Are you ready?
Yes. Yes.
Have you ever seen a snail with stilted eyes and slimy tail, and wondered where he's coming from or where it is he'll go. Such questions truly are not dumb, for snails themselves don't even know. Their origins, a mystery. Their destiny, invention. They're always coming to and from the eternal snail convention. They come to share their stories there, of travels made, of how and where, on adventures lived, they paid attention. To and from the snail convention. Now, wherever you may find a snail, take the time to trace its trail. It takes some patience, but you'll see the convention is their destiny. The oldest snail spoke to the young, of days when all the snails were one. His stilted eyes reached heaven high and sent his message through the sky to touch the eyes of other snails, the first real form of snaily mail.
When I was a young slug, he said, I had no home upon my back, and naked I trekked through the land until a friend reached out his hand. I had awoken in the grass and stretched my eyes and saw at last, gathering from morning dew and stepping forth this form of blue. And in his hand he held a shell, a spiral home. He wished me well. With hand outstretched and friendly gaze, I received my home in time and space. He held more other shells as well. One he dropped, perhaps it fell, and another slug crawled in its hole. It fit him well, that was the goal. And then he returned to the glittering glass ruins to continue its early morning doings.
And all the snails so paid attention and told stories at the snail convention. But one snail, he was smart but mean, told a story that was unforeseen. He told the snails a horrid secret no snail could have guessed. He said,
Fools, there is no convention. You all have been deceived. But now that I have told you this, you all have been relieved. There is no need for storytelling. It's silly and absurd. Each of you are all alone. I can't believe you hadn't heard. And all the snails awoke so sudden and found themselves alone. And none of them had spinal cords, no brains or even bones, just complex like nervous systems that telepathically impart the stories that all other snails had carried in their hearts. But now the illusion had been shattered and broken into shards, and what once seemed like a snail convention had now fallen apart. Until a smart young snailian, who had long been wandering about, found the great solution that no snail can do without. He smiled and slimed ideas that the other had undone. He knew he didn't have to, though he simply found it fun. And so he spent his hours, slow as snails can be, crafting this new message for other snails to see. Brothers, sisters, children, in your spiral homes, he said. The other told you lies, and he sent them to your head. There is a snail convention. You are not truly alone. So began his message sent through the snailophone. This gathering, I tell you, he continued to imply, is always going on. There is no way to pass it by. It's not some excuse to settle panic as the other would have you believe. And your existence isn't purposeless. He tried to make you grieve, for he himself was frightened, so lonesome and forlorn that from his lack of truth such an ugly lie was born. The answer I shall tell you. The truth you now shall see. We're always at the snail convention.
Woo!
Wherever we may be.
Woo!
Sharing stories in a collective field of his story. Thank you.
Yay!
The longest sales pitch in history. Well, folks, I've got 2 books that I'm selling. One of them is a collaboration with 35 different artists. It's called The He and the She of It, and it's not about gender theory. The second one was created in the jungle. It's called Impatient Transformations, just like this lesion on my hand and face. Healing, slow as snails. I've also created, in the last few weeks, 100 tiny pareidoodles. That is, tiny little divine designs that are going for $25 a piece. They can be found at the front. You can leaf through the book. Robin is holding it up right there. So please look through them with a friend and converse about what you see in there. Also, the ones on the walls, of course, are larger journeys to explore and unearth. And hopefully you'll find your way back to this very room with stories of your own to tell. We're also doing a raffle. The picture didn't show up, but it's right there at the front. For $5, you could be a contestant who could win an original divine design. Tell your friends we're doing this digitally as well.
Woo!
And I think that concludes my presentation. Thank you for coming to my heart-opening art opening.
Everyone give it up for Michelangelo.
Yeah!
Give it for the psychedelic space. Psychedelic space. Yes. 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 God. Give it up for God. Give it up for not God. No God. No God at all.
Atheism.
Gravity. Are you guys into gravity? Wind. You hate wind. You like wind.
Sun God.
Anyways, so yeah, we found Michelangelo in the bottom of a cave of Baba Yaga's. It was very difficult. It was the bottom of the cave. We found it was the bottom of the cave, and Michelangelo came to New York, and I thought, oh, you're too smart. You're too smart for New York. There's too much happening. But anyways, I really want to reemphasize that. You're one of the great minds that I've ever met, and that there's art for sale. Like, so Michelangelo told me how much he was selling his art for, and I was like, this is a disaster. So there's art at like 1/10 the price it should be sold at on the walls. He did all the drugs, so you don't have to. But also, if you want to do the drugs, you can do them too. You can do the drugs. You don't have to do the drugs. But whatever you should do, you should
Buy the
support.
art.
You should support a psychonaut, a genius psychonaut, and I'm really glad you're here, and I'm glad you're all here.
You're all here, yeah.
Thanks for coming, all of you. Very good looking.
If there's any questions, I don't know. I've been talking at you
Let's do
and
Q&A.
monologuing. If there's any...
Okay. Q&A. Wait, this is how you do Q&A. So Kevin, you come up to the front and you talk into the microphone because the microphone's dick.
Okay.
This is Kevin. What's your Q&A?
It's not Kevin, it's Kelvin.
She says, get the hell out of here.
Get the L out. Okay, this is a very small detail, but I made a mental note to ask you later. It was when you were talking about the different spirits, not when you were talking about the Nagual, but yes, and you referred to the Spanish ones called duendes. And I'm familiar with that word, but from the flamenco use of it. You're familiar with both senses? Does the flamenco part come from an older folklore tradition in which a fairy-like spirit is called a duende?
That is a great question, Kelvin, with an L.
Can you rephrase the question?
Kelvin asked, when I talked about cheneques and alushas, I mentioned also the Spanish idea of a duende, which is kind of like a gnome or a dwarf. And he mentions that this is also a term that's used in flamenco. Lorca, the poet, wrote an essay about this, and later Nick Cave wrote another essay about this. Duende is like duende casa, it's like the lord of the house. So again, it's like the idea of a resident spirit, I guess. In flamenco, it's
What do you mean, lord, literally?
duende is dweller of the house,
Dweller.
which also I think cheneque or maybe alusha, one of those also means something very similar. Dweller. And so the idea in flamenco and other arts, as proposed by Lorca and Nick Cave, is that it's kind of like what we would call soul, like that has soul, but it's something more than that because it has something sinister to it, something diabolical, like the sense that you have looked at death and you have let it become you, so that now you can create from that place, kind of from that like fairy, that realm of fae, you know, that the dwelling of the duende. And it's not just something that possesses the performer, but it's something that is also felt by the audience. So when something has duende, it like possesses, there's a possession that takes place in the transmission. It reminds me of the show The OA. Has anybody seen The OA?
Yes!
Great show.
Great show.
A pox on Netflix for canceling it after 2 seasons when
A
they had 5
travesty.
planned.
Disaster.
Absolute travesty.
Super
But
fail.
there's
Sad.
there's this thing
Sad.
where these people have near-death experiences, and they're brought back, and they come back with a particular gift, and this sinister doctor scientist looks for these people and finds that quality in their playing, for instance, in their music. They have like this supernatural element from having passed over to the other side and come back. So that is what I identify as with duende. Does that answer the question?
It raises a lot more questions.
Yeah, probably. Then I have succeeded.
More
Mystery
questions.
loves company.
More questions.
Anybody else have a question? Yes. Please come. Yes, come up. Show yourself to the people. Let them see you, hear you,
We like
accept you,
One of us.
embrace you.
I just want to tell you that you remind me of another Dutch artist. He's a little older than you. Hieronymus Bosch. Did you like his
Woo! Woo!
images?
Yes.
Yeah, and just
High
on the
compliment.
top of your mind, because I'm interested. Like,
Buy them.
what are you afraid of in general? Like, what does first come to your mind when someone asks you that?
That is a great question. And I recently,
Yes.
like New York for this last week has been like an amazing experience, and I ended up writing a poem that kind of like summarizes my journey through it. And there's a moment in there where I admit fear of heights, but not in the sense of falling. And I mentioned also Milan Kundera, who just passed away, who wrote The Unbearable Lightness of Being, who talks about vertigo not as the fear of falling, but the voices of the depths beckoning us and us resisting, wanting to fall. In my case, the fear of heights has been the fear to rise, to allow myself to get myself out there, a fear of success in a way,
Yeah.
not the fear of failure, but the fear of success, and maybe, myself beyond that threshold. But it's something that I'm working in this moment to overcome by showing up and sharing myself with you. Thank you.
We're the front.
Amy, thank you for. I like this mode of getting the people up here.
Yeah, that was
Yeah.
fun. That was a
I
big
like
lead
break
up.
down the barriers.
You mentioned.
You get a parasite. You get a parasite.
Make
Nobody
it
gets a parasite.
louder. You're
Well,
handsome.
Can you hear me?
I like that.
Okay, sweet.
Yeah.
Thank you.
More.
So you were talking about like pareidolia and like seeing patterns or meaning in energies and symbology around us, and then you talked about some like local folkloric imagery, and I was wondering, you seem to be talking about rainforests and deserts and all of these places where the elements are really present, but somewhere like New York, there's concrete. Do you think that we can get in touch with like the local folkloric energy or consciousness, and if so, where might we look?
Bravo question.
Great questions.
Where the fuck we go?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of answered through the stain spotting idea. You gotta find your transcendence. That you gotta find the gods in the garbage. You gotta get dirty. It's like the gods, the spirits. They're in what Philip K. Dick called the trash stratum. It's like in the lowest tier. The filth, the stains on the sidewalk. That's your clouds here. That's your elemental world, and it's where the dirty metropolis metronomes rise from the seeming limitations of concrete. So that's the dirt of, and it's there's the city is such a human thing, but also because it is a human construct, it's almost like a god we've built. Like it's beyond our control in a way. It's an entity of its own. And like I said in that first mushroom experience, where everything is like circumstance, possessed by process. Like it's out of control. It's finding the human harmony too. Not the harmony of overwhelming and collective murder, but to find that harmony. Like Jake had a beautiful insight about the city, that it's engineered to have it has engineered dopamine hits built in. It's the idea of like you get to the train right as it arrives, the sense of like, yes, I am in sync with the human rhythm, the pulse, the vivacity, the vivacity, you know? So I think it's that, it's finding that human pulse, in the heart of stone, and beating it. Beat it! Yeah. Any more questions? Yes?
Just kind of going along with what you were just talking about. I'm a dog walker, and the dogs that I walk are constantly smelling stains and things. I see faces in the gum stains, and like, do you have any thoughts on like the smells? Like, so dogs see smells basically. Yeah. Do you think that dogs are seeing, you know, or like, do you have any thoughts on like the smell aspect? Yes. Olfactory.
Makes sense. Yes. First of all, there is a substance called 2CB. I've taken it twice, and every time I've taken it, I follow my nose, the knowing nose. Like I smell things far away and I follow that. Something doesn't smell good, I follow to where it smells good. I think what dogs are doing is they're going on snout book. You put them online, on leash, you walk them, they're following the trails that other dogs have left. They leave comments, they troll, they talk shit, and they're very much following, like obviously their preoccupations are simpler. There's like, what did this one eat? Is this one in heat? Like, let me, you know, this one, no, this is my block, you know? It's the graffitiing, things like that. I think, yeah, it's obviously like a more primal means of communication, but I did a song, I had a band called Thea Terra, and there's a song called Plant Teacher, and it starts off with sense of humor. Like I have an illustration of sense of humor where basically this disciple sits at the lotus feet of his teacher, but he gets distracted by a fly, and he realizes that this fly is mortal. It's just there for a day, and he realizes his own mortality through that. And then he becomes aware, basically the lines are, this fly, tracing circles in the sky. Today he flies around, tomorrow he may die. Oh me, oh my, how a mortal man could cry, for a fly's demise brings tears to my eyes. What's that scent? Something smells so sweet. Could it be